Hello, everybody. We are really glad that you join us today for this research talk. In fact, it's the first research talk of the year. Well, Happy New Year, although we are mid-January, and be the most welcomed. Today we have the pleasure, the great pleasure to welcome Honorable Frederick Iguban Rey from the Pontifical and Royal University of Santo Tomas in Manila, the Philippines. Frederick will share with us his knowledge and first-hand experience on approaching policymaking from research. More specifically, as you could see, the title of his intervention is Research and Statecraft, an Encounter with the Global South, because we are moving to the Philippines. We are in the so-called Global South. So Dr. Rey, Frederick, for friends, thank you so much for having accepted our invitation. As I said, we are really honored to count on you today.
Thank you so much, Monsi and Louis, for making this activity possible. Monsi, please allow me to acknowledge first our friends from the Philippines, and to our friends in Europe and other parts of the world. I think Sandra is here, and our friends from IFCU. It's a pleasure again to see you. And to our friends here in the Philippines, the invitation was sent to the office of our Research Bureau in Congress, and I hope Dr. Miral sent a representative. If you are here, we gladly welcome you. Of course, we want to acknowledge our friend again from Congress, Congressman Cabuchan and the team. Thank you so much for joining us, sir. Hopefully you can share with us also your insights in policy making. The same invitation was also sent to the office of the Vice Mayor, Hani Lacuna. She's a very good material to become the local chief executive of the Center of the Philippines in Manila. And the same invitation was also sent to the Department of Interior and Local Government, and Center for Liberal Democracy. I hope friends and colleagues from the University of Santo Tomas can also join us today. And also, I am not sure if my colleagues from the local government of Malinaw, Aklan are also here. We would like to welcome you all on behalf of IFCU and the Center for International Research and Decision Support. We are happy to be with you today. So let me begin my presentation by first.
Frederick, I will introduce you before that.
Okay, Monsi.
For those that don't know your biography, I will first introduce you, and then we will start with the presentation, with your presentation. Thank you, Frederick. Honorable Frederick Iguban Rey is a political sociologist from the Department of Political Science and the Sociology Department of the Pontifical and Royal University of Santo Tomas, as we said, in Manila, the Philippines. He holds a doctorate degree in political science, a Master of Science degree in sociology, and a Master of Arts degree in creative writing. He has specialized in the study of the Philippine political culture. Dr. Rey now leads the Politics and Public Policy Research Interest Group of the Research Center for Social Sciences and the Research Utilization Unit of the university. He also holds a post as a research associate of the Pontifical University of Salamanca in Spain under the Institute of European Studies and Human Rights, specifically on the role of the European Union in ethical governance in the area of artificial intelligences. And as a research associate, Dr. Rey has received commissioned research from national and international research organizations and agencies like the World Bank, the United Nations, or the Japan International Cooperation Agency. Aside from his teaching and research duties in the university, Dr. Rey, as you could hear, is also on his third term as a municipal councillor. He's a municipal councillor of the municipality of Malinao in the province of Aklan in the Philippines. And as I said, last but not least, Dr. Rey is an old friend of us. He has been collaborating with the Federation in several research and action research projects. And of course, we all have wonderful memories of that time. So now, Dr. Rey, you have about half an hour for your presentation. And after your presentation, we will have some time for questions, for debate, for the participants, so that they can share their experience, make any comments. So please, let me ask all the participants to switch off their mics to avoid any interference, and we will start with the presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Along. Monsi, thank you so much for that kind introduction. I was so excited to proceed to the presentation. Okay, for our guest, let me share with you that the presentation is divided into three. First, I am very much interested to share with you some insights about how we can understand power in relation to policymaking. Second, the relationship of research and statecraft or policymaking. And third, I am happy to introduce to you some tools that we were able to craft to help our policymakers in the examination or audit of our policies that we intend to be focused in the preservation of life, dignity, human rights, and democracy. This is the major interest of the presentation. So let me share my screen now to the group. Allow me to start this presentation by first arguing that the influence of a policy brief rests not purely in its design or its content, but also on the appropriation of power between and among actors involved in the interaction. Coming from a privileged point of view as a researcher and as a counselor for almost a decade as a local legislator, my experience is that laws are approved for some other reasons other than its ratio-legal or spatio-temporal characteristics. Like, laws are approved not because there is a need for it in relation to space and time, but because legislators need to feel good about ourselves. We need to feel good that we are working as legislators. There is a silent competition.
Frederick, are you sharing your presentation because we cannot see it?
Oh, sorry, Monsi. Yes, I am already sharing it. Let me. Can you
That's
see
great.
my screen?
Now it's on our screen. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you so much for calling my attention. The slide. Okay. The second point that I want to bring up in relation to my experience as a local legislator and as a researcher. I came to realize that laws are approved because there is a strong sense of reciprocity and collegiality among legislators. When I say reciprocity and collegiality, we tend to support each other in the passing and approval of laws. As the separation between scholarship and statecraft becomes apparent, the concentration of power likewise becomes more defined, and the location of the scholar in relation to policymaking may be characterized by an ill condition of actors with scarce capital, we as scholars, competing against actors with surplus capitals, the politicians. But with our recognition on the need to influence policymaking, especially in the era of the pandemic, our political actors their influence became really became magnified, or we came to realize that our politicians are really powerful. It is indispensable that first we accept our present situation with humility and hope. Modesty in the understanding that politics is a life that is independent from the theories and speculations of the academe. It is a being that can only be understood by assuming and presupposing nothing, since nothing is permanent in the political constructs. Instead, politics can only be or can maybe best understood by temporarily abandoning the security of our scholastic prejudgment and momentarily live a life of a politician. For our German friends, they call it Verstehen, or the empathic understanding. Hope, however, springs from the eternal nobility of a dialogue, allowing the politician and the scholar to achieve a unity of purpose and a symphony of action towards public administration. It is suggested that the academic's intellectual hubris led to the failure of past and present governments. The body politic was ruined by our arrogance, by thinking that our science alone can provide a remedy or solutions to our moral crisis. And as a defense, politicians shun us away and viewed us as a detached possibility. It appears that the reason governments fail in their efforts to cure social ills is twofold. On one hand, the inability of our politicians to achieve scholarship. And on the other hand, is the resistance of our academics from being politicized. Consequently, policymaking becomes an exclusive domain of pure politicians who hijack everything and all that is social. With limited information, the politician acts without knowledge and foresight, while the scholar unconsciously lives in an academic bubble, trapped by one's own monologue. In essence, the relationship between the academe and the policymaker is that of mutual distrust, each canceling each other out. There is, therefore, a proposal that sound policymaking requires the collaboration of primary institutions. We cannot leave it to the politicians alone. We have our family as an institution, the academe as an institution, our religion as an institution must work together. The dominance of one institution in understanding the varieties of human conditions is destined to fail, since its intellectual resources are too narrow and the universe is too complex. Thus, the starting place, as well as the arrival of this presentation, resides in the fact that policymaking cannot be taught, but instead it must be built through the accumulation of capitals. It is therefore the objective of this lecture to pave the way on how to understand the interplay of capitals in relation to statecraft. Now let us proceed to the first part of the presentation. That was the introduction. The first part of the presentation talks about the university and the social, where we are in relation to policy making. We have to, as scholars, we have to realize, we have to accept that our academic triumphs alone are inadequate to address the distempers of the state. What I suppose the university missed on a global scale was its tragic maneuverings to connect with its statesmen and women who were trained by the university. These politicians are rarely recognized, more so honored, since there is a stigma that these social actors are corrupt or untrustworthy. However, we are proposing that the new role of Catholic universities should be to develop alliances and collaboration that will abolish dole-out initiatives currently practiced by Catholic universities. The assistance given to our adopted communities becomes more enduring if we, together with our political allies, create policies that will institutionalize preferential options for the poor and the fragile. As a researcher, the context of statecraft is like this. In a not so distant past, an author named Ron Suskind described a meeting with an official of the Bush administration, the younger Bush. And in that conversation, we are reminded that as scholars, we have to once again reconsider how we address our stock and trade. The aid suggested that scholars like us are basically living a life of what we call the reality-based community. We are this kind of people who believe that solutions emerge from our judicious study of discernible reality. And most of us will agree on this. Susskind naturally concurred and murmured something and principles and empiricism. The aide got him off and said, that's not the way the world really operates anymore. We are an empire now, and when we act, we create our own reality. And while you are studying that reality judiciously as you will act again, creating new realities which you can study too. And that's how things will sort out. We are history's actors, and you are all of you will be left to study what we do. So this is, I think, also what is happening in the Philippines. Thus, we are proposing to reinvent the scholar and make him or her acquire the ability to accumulate capitals that can be used to balance the exchange of contending interests, necessary to create a network of interdependence and cooperation between the scholar and the politician. If there is an uneven terrain or distribution of power, an even relationship between the scholar and the politician, the scholar can easily be muted, dismissed, or his or her expert advice may not be entertained. In diagram, we can represent this kind of relationship. The politician at the tip of the pyramid, and along the way we have the technocrats and the consultants, the scholars within the orbit of power and influence. We now have next we have the bureaucrats, and we have at the bottom of the pyramid the university-based scholars. It is essential for us to identify the actors involved in the network of statecraft and the apparent pivot from theocracy of the early civilization to economic ascendancy in the first three industrial revolutions, and finally to the institutional dominance of the political institution in the VUCA era, we are reminded to be constantly vigilant of the power of the politician. Since the politician acts as the people's representative in an indirect democracy, it has become incumbent upon the politician to assume the sole responsibility of policymaking. The democratic process manifested during the election seems to legitimize the politician's sovereign role in regulating the social environment. Furthermore, technocrats who are outside of the orbit of power and influence remains to be at the periphery of policymaking, while academics who succeeded in breaking through the orbit of power and influence appeared to become more political rather than scholarly. They abandoned their previous location as scholars and became more of an ally of the politician to provide scientificity to the politician. Thus, the dichotomy between scholarship and statecraft continue to persist as scholars and politicians try to find a more hospitable ground for collaboration and restraint. We are therefore reminded of Bourdieu's distribution of capital. And in the network of exchanges and policymaking, the scholar is left indigent and marginalized. In this distribution of capital, the scholar appears to establish a good presence in only one of the four dimensions of capital. And such destitution allows the political elites to capture the formulation of collective objectives and mobilizing actors and resources therefore. In a tabular presentation to our left, we can see that the scholar is equipped with his or her technical qualifications. And on the right, we have the political elite capturing the social, symbolic, and economic capitals. Let me go through a bit on this, on the power of the politician. The social capital refers to the connections and networks that can be accessed and mobilized to influence policymaking. Symbolic capital refers to the prestige and honor of the politician. In practice, the scholar is completely overshadowed by the imposing presence of the politician, since there is a universal recognition of the prestige and honor embodied by the politician. Whereas the scholar in the Philippines appear to be an adjunct member of the policymaking bodies, a guest for consultative entities whose sole purpose is to provide an aura of scientificity rather than of real influence, a part-time member of the circle of power and influence that can be muted at any moment, a tragedy for scholars. But upon closest of inspection, the gap between policymaking and scholarship creates a colossal misfortune, that is, the intellectual degeneration of the entire nation. Such unfortunate condition of ill education and miseducation can now be easily noticed when most of us prefers to abandon values that we once hold dear, like human life, dignity, human rights, and democracy. Of course, the third capital that was captured by the politician is the economic capital. And we know very well that you cannot mobilize a political machinery without acquiring or without possessing economic capital. The colossal misfortune mentioned earlier is primarily the product of the fact on how truths are created in the ground. The real power of the politician resides not in his or her prestige or honor, but in his or her capacity to produce new truths with immense and almost permanent social consequences. In sociology, at the stages of truth production or cultural production, we may begin with the introduction of new ideas, innovation like the cellular technology or the computer technology. Then it will provide us with new experiences. Once the experience is, or when the experience is rewarding, it will create a new habit. It will be collectively accepted. It will become part of our daily life or sedimentation, and it will become part of our institutions. Like you can no longer enter a university, for example, without having an email account assigned by the university. But in the case of the politician, the first 5 stages of truth production are violated. Politicians can go straight to the creation of laws with collective consequences. Thus, the executive, the president, for example, and the legislative departments, the Senate and the Congress, may appear to be more powerful than the judiciary, since these two supposedly co-equal branches reduce the judiciary, supposedly also co-equal with the legislative and the executive, reduced the judiciary to the mere interpretation of what was crafted by the politician. And because of that, laws can easily be weaponized against our own citizens. Once again, we would like to present how the scholar is removed from the center of power and influence. The second part of this presentation talks about the nature and essence of policymaking, or the concept of good governance. And we are pretty sure familiar with, there's the concept of responsive governance. There's nothing wrong about this. But we are also proposing that aside from the government being responsive, our government should also be anticipatory or proactive. That's why we are suggesting a kind of government that is responsive and at the same time anticipatory. This is where scientists and scholars can share their expertise in the formulation, development, allocation, and implementation of policies. We can predict, we can, as scholars, we can discover laws governing the universe, governing the cosmos. This is where we can share our expertise. This is the terrain of science and the academe in relation to policymaking. The third part of our presentation is about science in the practice of policymaking. I am happy now to introduce to you the tools that we can use to audit or evaluate our policies. Because in practice here in the Philippines, we look at, or we treat our policies based on first, common sense, and second, based on laws. Thus, we are saying that in the domains of the legislative formulation, the power of the legislative to introduce and the executive to approve laws and vice versa are most of the time determined by the rational legal framework. Policy intentions such as legalization, prohibition, regulation, promotion, and facilitation of an act, object, or plan is measured solely by de jure, or the lawfulness of that policy, or its origin, the lawfulness of its origin. This single-mindedness in the legal exclusivity in lawmaking may be remedied by the multitude of academic theories that are embodied by the scholar. So we are now proposing, we are now suggesting that tools can be used to examine or to evaluate the policies that we make or the policies made by our policymakers. First, we can engage in what we call content analysis, or in literature we call it close reading. In research, we call it content analysis, but we can use it also in examining our policies by first focusing on the intention of the policy, where to go. It answers the question where to go. Policy instrument tells us about or answers the question what to do. And policy intervention answers the question of how to do it. We are suggesting that our policies can be examined based on these layers or levels of analysis. But the implementation of the policy should be examined using a reversed pyramid, arguing that the policy intention should outweigh the policy intervention. It is proposed that in most cases, the militarization of policy interventions invalidate the just, humane, and life-giving nature of the law. For example, in the case of the Philippines, the COVID containment mechanisms were dominated by the military mindset. Thus, instead of us preserving life, people were punished, people were killed during the pandemic because there was a prioritization or the dominance of the intervention mechanism from the military perspective overcame or overpowered the real intention of the law, which is to preserve life. So we are suggesting that policy intention should maintain primacy over other layers of analysis or aspect of the law. The second tool that we can use in the analysis of our policies is the net balance analysis or the functional analysis of our policy. We are arguing that there are at least two levels in the analysis of the law. First is the manifest or the intentional or the pronounced, the obvious intention or function of the law. And the second level is that latent or the hidden function of the law. And therefore, we created the formula. The formula tells us about the functional consequence or the net balance of the policy is the relationship between the functional consequences of the policy less the non-functional, the dysfunctional, and the over-functional consequences. We have to remind our policy actors that once there is, or in the occasion that there is an over-functioning of an institution, such over-functioning may also result to dysfunction. Like again, in our case, the over-functioning of the military as an institution resulted to the death and unjust punishment of our people in the Philippines during the COVID crisis. The second level of analysis, or the net balance level 2 analysis, tells us about the unanticipated functional consequences in relation to the unanticipated dysfunctional consequences and the unanticipated irrelevant consequences. We have to be very aware of this unanticipated consequences, because we cannot subject our people to policy experiments. A few months ago, we implemented here in the Philippines, we implemented the car seat law. But our legislators failed to realize that there is a shortage, there is a limited supply of car seats in the Philippines. So if I can remember it right, the law came into effect for less than 24 hours before it was suspended. To synthesize the net balance analysis, net balance 1 plus net balance 2 should be greater than the non-functional, the dysfunctional, the overfunctions. The unanticipated consequences of the legislation. The third tool that we are proposing or that we can consider is a tool that we can use to analyze the relationship of the suggested or the policy or the proposed law in terms of how will it affect the self, how will it affect the group, how will it affect the social institutions, how will the policy affect these units of analysis, like for example the approval of the use of contraceptives in the Philippines, and how will it affect our religious institution. The fourth tool that we can use is the human rights-based analysis. We are again suggesting that we have to examine the policy in terms of its urgency relating to the purity of time. We have to examine the policy based on its relationship to culture, how distant or how close it is to the lived or to the real experiences of our people, to the lived experiences or to the culture where it is, where it intends to be implemented. The relationship of this policy in relation to the role of money, will it marginalize or exclude the population? And the role of experts in terms of how the experts would look at these policies in listening to our to the social media. Also, there's a need for us under the human rights-based analysis, there's a need for us to understand the location of power and how will the policy increase or decrease the power of the state. Like for example, in the Philippines again, there is what we call the anti-terror law. And the anti-terror law, for many of us, and using this tools of analysis, we can see that it really magnified the power of the state at the expense of the people. So let me conclude that the role of the academics as a scholar and as a technocrat revolves around his or her capacity to accumulate capitals if he or she intends to assume a position of significance in nation building. For most of us from the university, strategic labeling and amplification of individual successes to herald the symbolic transformation of the academic is necessary. Culture is myth-making, therefore we have to struggle towards the relocation of scholar in history and culture, for the scholar to exist on the same level with the policymakers. A shift from a culture of academic dwarfing to a creation of cultural academic celebrities. The era of predatory, self-righteous, self-criticizing academic must be overshadowed by the creation of scholars as cultural superstars. Universities around the world must espouse the culture of academic charity accorded to its scientists. The renewed value of the academic and the new status of the scholar after the cultural shift renders one the intellectual fame needed to initiate dialogues with the politicians, lobbyists, interest groups. The same social capital is necessary for the scholar to build new relationships that will be needed for the scholar to be heard in policymaking body. We have to be confident that our science has the capacity to lend the tools necessary to steer the direction of a nation towards true humanism. However, our unwillingness to accommodate the distinct universe of politics frustrates our innate desire for social transformation. Thank you so much. And this is the end of our presentation. I hope we shared some meaningful insights to the participants. Again, thank you.